We are in the middle of LS swapping my 1972 Dodge Challenger, but today we're going to be fabbing up a low buck turbo kit for it. Since we are putting a Chevy engine into a Mopar, I'm going to be running into some difficulties, but the whole process isn't too different from what you would see if you were swapping any kind of other car. And then we're going to see just how much it actually costs to turbocharge an LS engine. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So starting with the turbo manifolds themselves, I've got actually 4 options that I've accumulated over the years, and they vary a little bit in price, anything from $100 for the shorty to $250 to $300 for the hookers, and then the very popular up and forward type headers. So starting with the turbo manifolds, we're starting with the 100% stock factory manifolds, followed by a set of cast iron aftermarket manifolds. These ones tend to be a little bit more low profile, but they flow about the same as the stock manifolds. After that, we've got aftermarket stainless shorty headers, which again also flow about the same as the hooker and the stock manifolds. And then last but not least, the very popular up and forward type generic turbo headers. Unlike a naturally aspirated build, it doesn't necessarily matter too much. As long as it fits where it needs to fit and it does what it needs to do, you should be fine. You don't need any kind of super special turbo header for a V8. If you're doing 4-cylinder or max effort stuff, then sure, you can splurge a little bit and get $500, $1,000 turbo headers. Maybe even more expensive than that, honestly. But for all the low buck stuff, these are basically your options right here. The main benefit of switching from cast manifolds to stainless manifolds is actually going to be the difference in weight. To put that into perspective, I went ahead and I set up 2 scales here. So now let's go ahead and grab the stainless manifold and put that on one of the scales. That measures at around 6 pounds. Now we're going to go ahead and grab this aftermarket cast iron one, and we're at 11 pounds. Multiply that by 2 and we're looking at a 10-pound difference between these and these. Now to compare the aftermarket manifold to the stock one, let's see what the weight difference is. So we're going to go ahead and put that one on the scale as well. And we're looking at a 0-pound difference between the stock manifolds and the aftermarket manifolds. And we're still seeing a 5-pound difference between the stainless shorty header and the stock manifold. Now let's switch things up and do the same thing, but with the up and forward type header. So we're going to go ahead and lay this on the scale. And we're looking at a 2-pound increase, 8 pounds total from the shorty header to the up and forward type headers. Now, like I mentioned, these are about $100 or $150 right now on eBay, and you end up shaving about 10 pounds. So the question is, for $100, would you shave 10 pounds off your engine? Now, there is a drawback for the stainless header, and that is that it does not keep the heat or the heat energy inside of the tubes very well, whereas the manifold is a lot thicker, a lot denser. It tends to insulate the engine bay from the heat a lot better. The stainless manifold is just too thin, so as heat is running through these tubes, it's dissipating into the engine bay, increasing engine bay temps, but you're also losing some of that heat energy going into a turbo setup. As you guys might know, when things cool down, they get smaller. So if the gases inside the tube get smaller, that means you have less exhaust going to the turbo. It means that the turbo is going to spool a little bit slower. On the flip side, they look really cool compared to the stock manifolds. So it's just one of those little things that you have to decide whether or not you're going to want to splurge on the nice stuff, even though you might lose a little bit of performance, or if you want to save some money and go with the stock stuff, even if it's going to cost you some weight down the road. Now, jumping back over to my car, I'll let you guys know that every single one of those headers will fit perfectly on this side of the engine bay. I've got plenty of room between the side of the head and the steering box, the inner fender. I've got plenty of clearance, no issues. Problem child is actually on the passenger side. As you guys know, a lot of manufacturers tend to offset their engines over to the passenger side a little bit, and because of that, you get a lot less clearance on the passenger side than you do on the driver's side. So as you can see here, I've taken a driver's side header and flipped it around and installed it facing down. And originally this manifold did not fit in here. The factory exhaust flange was actually too big and it was hitting the frame rail. When I tried to install the shorty header, the 2 front tubes were actually hitting the shock tower, so there was no chance that I'd be able to use that one. The hooker manifold was actually pointing straight down, and there would be no way to install a pipe on the bottom side of that manifold. With that being said, it's pretty obvious that the up and forward type header was just not going to fit at all. So my best bet on the passenger side is to actually take the stock manifold, cut the flange off, and then later on we're going to weld something to this manifold so we can use it again. Some of you guys might have realized that this is the driver's side manifold that I just turned around and installed on the passenger side. As for using the passenger side manifold on the driver's side, that's going to be a different story. So this is the passenger side manifold that I flipped around, and as you can see, there's no way for me to point it down like I did on the other side. The steering box is actually interfering with the manifold, and if I flip it around, it's going to be pointed up but toward the back. But I actually do have a solution, so let me show you guys. So what you're looking at here is another driver's side manifold that I just flipped upside down, and now it's pointing up. Because it's pointing up, I don't have any kind of interference problems with the steering box. And because the engine's further to the passenger side, I don't have any interference to the shock tower. The only problem is that if you don't have two driver's side manifolds, you won't be able to do this. So you'll have to go to the junkyard and go get another one. Lucky for you guys, you can find them all over the place on OfferUp, on Marketplace. People do not want these manifolds, and they're just trying to get a little bit of money for them for you to take it off their hands. I've seen them as little as $5 and as much as $25. And if you go to the junkyard, it's probably going to run you about $25 to $50. Now, if you spend a little bit more money, you could actually switch this out with this. What you're seeing now is the shorty header that we just looked at not too long ago. The same shorty header that was 5 pounds lighter than the stock manifold. The flange is significantly smaller, and you've also gained more clearance from the shock tower and inner fender to the V-band or flange. Another benefit is that because this header is 5 pounds lighter than that manifold and the driver sits on this side, it's actually giving you a little bit better balance up in the front end because you've taken 5 pounds off the left front, but you've maintained the right front the same. If you're not really concerned about racing or weight or corner balancing, then that doesn't really apply to you. The negative side of this is that you've just spent $100 to $150 in manifolds. You can only use one of them, and now the right side does not match the left side. Like I said, if that's one of the things that does not bother you, then you can do it this way. Since we're doing a low buck turbo kit, I'm not going to bother spending the extra money. My local junkyard sells these manifolds for $35. After some BS and taxes, it ends up like $50. So we're going to go ahead and add $50 to our budget and run 2 driver's side manifolds. There we go. A penny saved is a penny earned. So let's go ahead and move on to the next order of business, and that's going to be turbo placement. Now, while you're roaming the internet, the Googles, the Instagrams, looking at turbo kits, turbo cars, the way things that other people have done it, you'll start to realize that even though the turbos look like they're nice and tucked away, they're in the perfect spot, it's got clearance from everything, it looks 100% nice. Once you look closer, you'll realize that, wait a minute, they don't have any coolant hoses, or wait a minute, there's no accessory drive, wait a minute, there's no radiator. And what a lot of these guys tend to do is that they'll mock up their turbo kit in a way that makes it look like that's what they're gonna run, but they'll either never get around to it, or they'll have to chop up the car in a way that it can never be turned back the way it was. So we're going to try to keep the modifications to the car as minimal as possible. But this is going to be a running, driving, and racing car, as you guys will see in the coming weeks after this thing's all done. The next question is, are we going to be doing a single turbo kit or a twin turbo kit? I'll tell you right now, every time I've tried to figure out how to set up a twin turbo kit, I always default back to the single. It doesn't matter if it's on a truck, doesn't matter if it's in a car. Every time I start to figure out the plumbing and the downpipes and everything, I realize that a single turbo is going to be a lot easier, a lot simpler than trying to run a dual turbo setup. Maybe later on when we have a little bit more time, we'll do a low buck twin turbo kit, but a single turbo kit is way cheaper than a twin turbo kit. Since we're trying to keep everything on a budget, we're going to stick to a single turbo setup. As for the turbo itself, let me show you what we got. Now I've got 3 turbos here on the table. The one on the right is a GT35 Garrett turbo clone. The one on the far left is a 7875 Precision turbo clone. And the one in the middle is a VS Racing 6870. Typically the 68 and the GT35 are turbos that are used in twin turbo setups. The GT35 is about a 600 horsepower turbo with a really small exhaust housing. The 6870 is about a 700 horsepower turbo with a really small exhaust housing. This one is a T4, however, and this one is a T3, which means the bottleneck for this one is going to be a little bit higher on the exhaust side than it will on the GT35. Now the one on the far left is an 800 horsepower turbo. This is a 7875. Now as you can see, the exhaust housing is significantly bigger than the one on the 6870. So the bottleneck on the 7875 is going to be higher than on the VS Racing turbo. Since we're going to be putting this in front of a 5.3, you could theoretically run this turbo and be fine. I've ran the 7875 and it's a pretty responsive turbo. There is a little bit of lag, but it's really not that much, especially for a street car. But the 6870 is going to be significantly more responsive, even though you'll get to that bottleneck a lot faster. The main difference here is price. You can get the GT35 for a little over $100. You can get the 7875 for about $250. You can get the VS Racing 6870 for I think $500. And we're actually missing one turbo that a lot of people like to use, and that's going to be the GT45, which is like a $150 turbo, and it's also an 800 horsepower turbo just like the 7875. The problem with the GT45 is that it takes forever to spool. I've driven my truck with the 7875, I've driven my Dodge Charger with the 7875, and I've also driven the Dodge Charger with a GT45, and there was a huge difference between the 45 and the 7875. The turbo is about $100 or $150 more expensive, but it's a significantly better turbo than the GT45. Lucky that the GT45 was a borrowed turbo and I didn't pay for it myself, but all the other single turbo setups that I bought turbos for, I've opted for the 7875. The reason I even own the 6870 is because we're going to be using these in a twin turbo setup for another build later on. The 7875 isn't really like a low buck turbo, but it's also not a $500 turbo. It's also not a $1,000 turbo, $1,500 turbo, $2,000 turbo. So this is 10% of the price of a high dollar turbo, with an insane performance gap between the GT45 and this one. So that's why I'm going with this one. Even though it's going to cost me a little bit more money, it's a significantly better turbo, especially for the 5.3. I went ahead and set the turbo here on the floor, but let's get back on topic and talk about turbo placement. So for a single turbo setup, there's basically only two options: the left side or the right side. First of all, even though we're using a mock-up block, I still installed the factory accessory drive to give me more of a clear picture of what's going to be required in order to get all the pipes to line up. If you guys pay attention to this right here, we've got two heater hoses that I can either loop and then cancel out, or I can run these to the factory heater box, which is eventually going to go right there. So if I do want to run the heater hoses, the hoses have to come out, run across the inner fender, and then meet back into the firewall. That in itself is not a big deal. That's pretty standard for any car running a heater. The only problem is that turbos require a downpipe, which means where the exhaust gases exit the turbine on the backside, we have to have some sort of pipe that comes out of it so we can lead that exhaust out of the car. On my truck and on the Dodge Charger, I've ran the exhaust somewhere to the front, either in front of the front tire or out of the fender. For this car, I wanted it to be a little bit quieter, a little bit calmer. Even though it's going to have a good amount of performance, I don't want it to just scream, even though the color scheme kind of already does that for me. I don't need to be more obnoxious than I need to be. So for this car, I want to run the exhaust all the way out to the back. And to do that, we actually need to run a pipe that would probably go around here and then feed into the back of this engine right here. Careful not to hit anything. And then it has to snake out behind the turbocharger. And so if we have a pipe that goes through here, we're going to need to make sure that the heater hoses that are leaving the water pump are not too close to the exhaust pipe, so that way we don't risk melting the hoses or overheating the coolant as it's trying to go back into the engine after the heater core. The next problem is actually the lower radiator hose that leads into the thermostat housing. So we have a hose that comes out through here, kind of snakes up here. I forget if it's a 45 or if it's an actual snake, but there is a hose that connects from here to here. Now let's look at the same situation on the opposite side. As mentioned, the engine is scoot over to the passenger side quite a bit, and so we have a ton of room here for a downpipe if we decide to install the turbo right here. As you can see, I haven't cut it out and the engine bay is freshly painted, but if need be, repainting this general area shouldn't be a real problem. The real issue is that even if you run the manifold out forward and then you feed the turbo right here, you're going to need to run the downpipe over the stock manifold and then have it feed right here behind the engine. Now you start to get really close to the firewall the further you go back. As you can see, you still have a decent amount of room between the manifold and the firewall, but you are going to run into some problems. Namely, there is a master cylinder and brake booster assembly right here. There's also a proportioning valve assembly right here. There's also metal brake lines right here. And your steering shaft goes from the steering gear out to the firewall right here. So there's a shaft that goes around here. I'm not saying you can't snake this pipe around this area, but you are going to be fighting everything quite a bit more than you will on the other side. From personal experience, I've always had a problem running the downpipe on the driver's side. To circle back to a point that we made earlier about corner balancing, if you install a single turbo setup on the driver's side, the majority of the weight of your turbo system is going to get added to the left front side of your car. Considering that all your brake system, steering, and driver's seat is on the same side, it's not really going to help you if you add another 50 pounds worth of turbo stuff on the left front corner. So to me, it's going to be easier to install the turbo on the passenger side. Speaking of passenger side, I went ahead and installed one of the fenders. As you can see, we are running two different colors here. This is the new color of the car. This was the old color of the car. This is more like a salmon color, a very light pink, pastel pink. The color on the right is actually Mopar FM3 Panther Pink. So eventually the whole car will be this color. Since I was in the middle of the swap, I went ahead and I painted the inside of the car while I was at it. The reason I installed the fender though is because I needed to figure out where the headlight placement was on this car. So we have the low beam headlight right here, and the high beam headlight is supposed to be somewhere around here. I was thinking originally that the headlights were actually further in, but now that we've got the fender on, it paints a much clearer picture. As you can see, there's this little indent in the fender, and that's actually where the sheet metal stops. So if we install the turbo where the compressor housing inlet is out of the engine bay, we'll actually line that up in this general area right here. If we try to keep the compressor housing inside of the engine bay, we're going to be fighting this area right here. If we also move the turbo a little bit higher, then we're going to be fighting this area. So I'd much rather not touch any of the core support. This is a unibody car, so the core support does provide additional support for the front end of the car. I don't want to weaken it if I don't have to. So my next step for me is to actually make a bracket that'll bolt the turbo onto this little ledge that's right here, and it'll help me line up the turbo better to the front, so that way if I drill a big hole right there, it'll lead right into the turbo instead of relying on ambient air to find its way into the turbo with a closed engine bay. The other reason why I want to make this bracket is just so I have something to help me hold the turbo onto the car. As you can see, I'm doing this with one hand and the other hand's recording, right? But this turbo is actually pretty heavy, and if I need to hold this for mock-up while I try to run a crossover pipe, it's going to be quite a bit of a hassle. So I'm going to need to find a way to bolt this onto the car, and hopefully in doing that, I'll be able to do everything by myself and not have to rely on someone to hold the turbo up for me. So I decided to put the turbo back on the table so we can look at the bottom side right here. As you can see, we've got plenty of clearance between the bottom of the turbo and these two bolts that are right here. These bolts actually just go in through the T4 to V-band adapter, and they can actually be replaced with longer bolts if need be. So let me show you guys what I'm thinking. If we have the bottom of the snail going like this, that's this part right here, and then we have the T4 flange that's going to be right here or so. And now we have these two bolts. So those bolts actually run through here. Those go into the V-band adapter, which is this guy right here. And the bolts go through here into there. So if we make the bolts longer, if we install longer bolts, I can then use the extra length to install a bracket that I can bend into an L shape that'll lead back into the car. And then where I have the little flange on the frame rail of the car, I can bend the sheet metal down and then run some bolts, probably 2 bolts, through this bracket that we're going to make into the frame rail. And that should hold the turbo up at a perfect 90 degrees and I won't have to physically hold the turbo anymore, and I'll be able to build the system around it. I'm just going to need to make sure I have enough clearance for the V-band clamp itself. That way I have enough movement that I can move it around or flip it upside down if I want to. But aside from that restriction, I can move it up or down however I want, as long as it doesn't hit the fender up on top. Jumping back on the car, you can kind of see what we're talking about. As long as we don't go above here, we should be able to raise a turbo as high as we want. All right, so here's the finished bracket. It's all bent up and good to go. I did all the bends with my press brake that I have right there, and it's just 1/4-inch plate, so it was fairly easy to bend. I actually gave this a little too much material, and I had to shave a bunch with my bench grinder in order to get it to fit on the turbo housing. But overall, I don't think it looks too bad. I rounded off the corners a little bit, and I still need to pretty this bracket up if I was going to keep it long term. But for right now, I think it's going to do great. Before I can fit this on the car, however, I need to figure out how much of the exhaust is going to pop out of the turbine housing, so that way I know how forward the turbo has to be in relation to the hole that I have over there. I have an old 90-degree tube that my brother tried to weld together a long time ago, but as you can see, it matches a 3-inch V-band, and it pops out of the turbo housing, and it makes a 90-degree turn right there. The issue is that we only have so much room inside that hole. So in order to fit the turbo in there and have the exhaust come back out, I'm going to need a tighter radius than what this tube can give me. I could try to cut this tube back maybe another couple inches or so, and then have this thing be a really wide cut right here. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go and add one of these pie cuts. I made these out of 3-inch mild steel. The idea behind this is that you would have your V-band, a 3-inch V-band right here. Then you would grab one of the pie cuts. These are about a 15-degree or so. Using a few of the pie cuts, you can actually cheat the mandrel a little bit and just tweak it a little bit more, so that way you can make that radius a little bit tighter. The other option is to actually stack several of these pie cuts together and then use these to actually make the turn yourself, so you could be able to do something like that. It's a lot more welding, and it's a lot more difficult to make this look good, but if push comes to shove, that is always an option. Now, I don't think I'm going to be using this pipe in particular. This is like a galvanized, aluminized piece of mild steel. I'm going to grab a clean piece of exhaust, and we might do it out of that one. All right, so this should give you a general idea of what we're actually going for. So these two planes are measured exactly away from each other, both 4 1/8 from here to here and here to here. So these two are parallel to each other, but you can see how much more it curves on the pipe that we made versus the pre-made pipe that was right here. As you can see, the bottom one takes up a lot less space than the top one, and the curve is a little bit more extreme, even though they're set up parallel to each other. So now we're going to go ahead and grab a V-band and attach this to the V-band, and then we're going to attach it to the turbo and see how well it fits on the car. Well, the good news is that the bracket that we made actually worked. I was able to fasten it right here in this little flange, and the turbo sits in a really good spot. The only problem is that it's really tight in there. As you can see, we tried to cheat a lot of clearance using this pipe right here, and we're still about a 1/4 inch away from the paint. And on this side, the compressor housing is actually touching right here, because it doesn't look like it kicked the turbo out far enough this way. And then also the turbo is actually sticking out too far forward from the core support by about 1/2 inch or so. So when I put the fender on, I think it's going to be in the way, but I haven't confirmed that quite yet. The solution to this part right here is actually pretty easy. What I can do is I can take this bracket and put a bend right here in the middle, just a little bit, just so I can get this turbo to sit down another 1/2 inch or so the turbo won't vibrate against the body. That's a pretty easy fix. I just got the bracket off, and we're back on the brake press right now. I think we're going to put a bend right here smack dab in the middle. And if you're wondering what side we're going to bend, we're actually going to bend it from this bottom side, so it'll go this way. It'll kind of V, upside down V, and then that'll bring the whole turbo and everything down. It'll point the exhaust side a little bit higher, but that's not a big deal. We can remedy that with a pie cutter too and get everything back the way it's supposed to be. So in order to get this brake press to work, we're just going to slip this bracket back here. I won't be able to get it all the way centered, but I should be able to still bend it. Get it nice and square, and then tighten this guy up and just keep going down on it until I put a nice little bend right there somewhere in the middle. So we don't really need that much of a bend. A little bit really does go a long way, especially when you're bending such thick metal. So it's already starting to put a little bit of a crease in it, probably right there. It'll spring back a little bit, so I'm gonna do one more. All right, that should do it. Let's go ahead and get this thing out of here and see what it looks like. And there we go, we got a nice little crease on here. We got it all bolted together now, and I'm telling you guys, a little goes a long way. It doesn't look like I really bent it that much, but check this out. I've got over an inch of clearance between the compressor housing and the inner fender without changing really anything. It was just this tiny little bend right here. And honestly, this might even be a little bit too far. I don't really need over an inch of clearance here, but I have it. And if it doesn't get in the way of anything else, then I'm just gonna leave it this way. So when you guys are making your own brackets, your own bends at home, remember that a little really does go a long way. Now we've got a few options here. The first one is to obviously continue the downpipe, the rest of the exhaust. In this case, I would put a 90, maybe a pie cut in the middle of between this pipe and the next pipe, just so I'd be able to make that turn easier, and then decide where exactly I'm gonna run along the motor, and then drop behind it, continue it out to the back. I can't do that yet because, as you can see, there's no transmission back there yet. So I'm actually waiting for a sheet metal oil pan so I can modify it to fit the Mopar. And so until that's done, I won't have a transmission. So the downpipe's out of the question for right now. Option 2 is to work on the pre-turbo piping. That's taking both manifolds, running a pipe across, connecting both of them together, and then having them end up in the turbine housing. Like I said, the engine is not in its permanent location yet, so I can't really rely on the manifolds being exactly where they're going to be. So this is pretty much as far as I can basically go right now. By the time you guys are watching this video, I've probably already installed the proper LS engine and fabricated the oil pan, so make sure to check out those videos when they do come out. If you guys have any questions on what we've done so far or anything that I'm going to be doing in the near future, let me know in the comments down below, because we've got a lot of content coming out really soon. I will see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher, signing out.